Gone with the Wind. And can I show you that statue? And all these Confederate monuments were built. Oh, what got its start again after the birth of the nation? What group? Yeah, the Ku Klux Klan. Including in all these monuments, the Klan would get a start, and the monument that would be the furthest north of all Confederate monuments would be in what city? Helena, Montana. Yeah. Don't forget, 4 Georgians were a bunch of Confederates. The vigilantes were a bunch of Confederates. And I told you I live a block away from Breckenridge Avenue and a couple blocks away from Davis Street, after Jefferson Davis. So we have an interesting history. And so let's go and get to the West. Let's go to the West and the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age, I'll tell you more where that term comes from, 1860 to 1900. And just a few things about it. Obviously, we can't go into detail about the West. But when the West we really talk about are these last states. The last states, or another way to look at it is the last of the American Indians that were holding out. And the big reason they're holding out is because they lived in an area that the United States did not want yet. They wanted other areas first. So the West and the Gilded Age. And this last area would, of course, be where my mouse is. The Plains, the Great Plains. And this kind of vague area here. Why? Because that's an area where it gets, the Plains is not like a set place. So you can say, this is the exact Plains. The Plains basically means areas that it rains less than 20 inches a year. And that can shift a little bit on the margins. So it's not mountains, but it doesn't rain. 20 inches a year is considered the amount of rain needed to plant a crop and produce enough off of that crop to make a living. It requires 20 inches of rain or more. Actually, now it's more than that, but that's what it's considered then. So the settlers moving to California to take that land there got over this as quick as possible. And that's how come these tribes would be the last ones. So when people talk about the West and the Old West, they're really referring to this area and not California, or at least much of California. And so the Plains Indians, these are the last tribes to hold out. And the important thing to understand before we get to anything else, remember the Eastern tribes tried, most importantly, the Battle of Fallen Timbers at Tecumseh at Tippecanoe for the last efforts. I put Tecumseh and Tippecanoe on that list of terms. I'm mentioning it again, so anybody want to guess one of the terms that will be for sure on there? I'll give you another hint. Bacon's Rebellion? Oh yeah, no doubt. Okay, so by definition, they're nomadic because it doesn't rain as much. So the tribes had to be small, so they controlled how many children they had. You know, they wanted to make sure it wouldn't get too big. They might plant crops, especially before the 1500s, on river bottoms, like along the Platte or along the Arkansas River, but then move and then come back in the fall and harvest. The only time these Plains tribes would be stationary would be during the winter. You know, they'd hunker down in one spot to get through the winter. The bison would be a key element following the bison herd. It's going to be about 30 million bison in about 1500, maybe as big as 50 million by 1800. Not as many hunters. How many bison would be left by 1890? A little over that, but anywhere from 1,000 to 1,000. But still, almost none. Oh, I know. I say buffalo all the time, and I know you do too. Buffalo are actually an Eurasian animal or African animal. They're technically bison. You're not wrong, but I try to say bison. I just want to say buffalo all the time. And with the arrival of the horse with the Spanish in the 1500s, that would dramatically change the nomadic tribes. They could now hunt more efficiently, follow the buffalo faster, become more nomadic. They hunted less, and you combine that with the diseases. Farmed less along the plains. And so it totally changed the tribal nature. Boy, did they take to the horse. And don't forget, the horse was an American animal, but the first peoples, when they arrived, killed and ate all the horses. But But as people went from Asia over, horses went the other way, and so ironically came back with the Spanish. Disease did ravage the Plains tribes, but because they were smaller and more nomadic, less stationary, not quite the same as it would just devastate the tribes here or along the coast. That's also part of the reason why these areas would be taken by the United States first. And so the Plains tribes, oh, one more thing I should add about the Plains tribes. It's really hard to say exactly what were the Plains tribes in 1500. We have a good idea. But the tribes here, when the first Europeans arrive, they're going to be part of a whole chain of events that happen when the tribes here will be pushed and pushed. The Lakota lived here, but they're going to be pushed by European explorers to here, and boy, will they take to the horse. But they really weren't necessarily a Plains tribe in 1400, but when I think of Plains tribes, I think of Lakota and Cheyenne, because I grew up in Montana, and Arapaho and Assiniboine. That's what I think of, it's Lakota. They're all being kind of bounced westward. So this is a painting from 1840s, a watercolor of now, this is Cheyenne, that's supposed to be in what is now Kansas, hunting this vast bison herd. And so the Oregon Trail would be the first real large incursion into the Plains land by the United States. But also you have the Santa Fe Trail and but this cut right through that Plains land. And there's going to be fights, conflicts along the way. You know, the people going along the Oregon Trail were getting across there as fast as they can. But still, there's going to be conflicts. And that's going to lead directly to the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty. And basically what the treaty said, this massive meeting of tribes in one of the only U.S. forts in the Plains, right here, Fort Laramie. Now, it's not where Laramie, Wyoming is. It's not the most beautiful area of the country, but the fort is now built by the Park Service, and it's really cool. It's another one of those, wow, that's really neat. But this massive grouping, one of the largest grouping of Plains Indians ever, would come to Fort Laramie. And they hammered out a treaty where the Plains Indians would get this land forever if they allow people to go on the trail. Now, you know, forever lasted about, 10 years. But don't forget the Treaty of Greenville in 1794. That said this would be American Indian land forever. And that lasted about 1 minute until the United States started taking the land, citizens of the U.S. And so Fort Laramie Treaty, the United States is going to violate it completely. Some tribes will, but I'll be very clear, the American government did it. And so the mining, though, would be the first major incursion where they stayed in the plains. I know what you're thinking, wait a minute, the mining would be in mountains for the most part. That isn't directly in the plains. But there's got to be more trails, more settlements, more commercial centers because of the mines. And so large numbers of miners came across, and they need food. Here's hydraulic mining. This is near Helena. Placer mining near Helena. Or this is my words are gone now. Placer mining and sluice mining. Yeah. And a lot of Chinese immigrants who came originally to build the railroad, then came up to places like Montana to work on the mines. They're the ones that the Helena clan attacked in 1915. And this major incursion, here's the main, those are the gold mines in the west. Every gold dot is a mine. Almost all of them didn't play out very much, and they're all now open, leaking mercury and lead into our water supply as we sit. And gold and silver were the first big ones. Okay, it wasn't until 1873 the United States would get on a national system called the gold standard, but currency was backed by gold, and then silver was usually valued about 1/20th, 1/16th of an ounce, as much. And so that was first amount of money. In fact, what happened is they'd mine gold and then have to sell it to the U.S. government, but it guaranteed money. The U.S. required the gold because that's going to be the basis of currency they would issue. But every place there's gold, there's going to be lead. And every place there's silver, there's going to be copper. And so that would lead to secondary mines. In fact, one of the big mines in Colorado, gold mines, is going to be soon dubbed Leadville. One of the first gold mines in the Black Hills will soon be called lead. Everyone says lead, but it's spelled lead. For whatever reason, they say lead. I mean, it's the same word, but it comes from lead. And so Butte tried gold, didn't really work, but there was a big silver mine there. The silver played out, and I'll tell you why in 1890, but wherever there's silver, there's copper. Almost always. Just no, silver, there's going to be a big thing of copper. The second industrial revolution is going to begin. What do you need copper for? Yeah, electric wires. And that's what would make Butte what they would soon dub the richest hill in the world. Oh, all the money would leave the state, but the richest hill in the world. That's why Butte would be 120,000 people by the end of World War I. That's why Butte's a big ghost town today. That's another story for down the road. Yeah, it was all copper. It was all copper. And the first time I went to Butte, there wasn't water in it. There was still pumping. And that water is so toxic, it's not shocking. It's of everything they exposed with the mine and what they used to mine. Well, a couple things. Comstock Lode would be the first real big hit outside of California. Right here, the Comstock. This was, in fact, Comstock, that literally meant a massive thing, a huge hit. Well, then the next big place would be Colorado. And that's why Denver, as the commercial center for this, would just overnight go from nothing to a relatively large city because of the mines here. And then what's the next place? Yep, this very classroom, Montana. And those would be the three big hits. And here's the thing. You're going to have all these miners now crossing the plains, some staying in spots, but the big thing is they need food. And that means they're going to have to send people out to kill bison. And that is now a direct threat to the Plains tribes. Oh, sure. On the Oregon Trail, a lot of the people went along there did kill bison, but nothing like what's going to happen on the plains. And so the next big thing would be the Transcontinental Railroad Act. This will accelerate the death of the bison, well, exponentially. So it's also called the Pacific Railroad Act, passed in 1872, and it's massive government aid for just two companies and eventually more companies. A massive government aid. Lincoln wanted this. It could be passed because Southern Democrats are not in Congress. Remember that whole Civil War thing. But massive government aid for business, helping, picking winners. This new thing called corporations and picking which one will get rich and which ones will fail. That seems to go against, I put the initials that help you trigger a memory. Laissez-faire. Yet all the companies that got the government money said, we believe in laissez-faire. They love government aid. And then let us do whatever we want with it. That's the hands-off part. Does government help business today? That's pretty much what all government money goes to, is helping business. In fact, we still subsidize oil companies about $400 billion a year. We get lots of money for business. Lots and lots and lots. And then protecting patents and things like that. And so, it involved two major things, and this is huge aid. Basically, no interest loans. Government money to loan, so free money. This is huge, like wow, and very, very flexible payback strategies, like whenever you want, of loans. For every mile of track on the plains, the companies would get $16,000 for every mile. Foothills, 32,000, mountains, 48. Okay, because it's more expensive. And eventually those will be doubled. That is just huge money that the company could get. And they could do anything they want with that money. They could build the railroad. Or they could do what? Give all the owners of the company a big raise. That's what the Northern Pacific Railroad would do that went across Montana. They just pocketed the money. And then went bankrupt. And then massive land grants. I put it all caps so you get the idea that they're big. Now you might be wondering how big. Now this is slightly exaggerated, but the Democratic Party attacked this Republican bill, and this is a decade after the law was passed, so after the Civil War, 1872. Here is the Democratic platform. After this is 84. And you see all this land right here that's shaded? That went to the railroads. Not quite. I'll show you exactly how they did it, but that went to the railroads. And it would be double. This is the land that will go to the Northern Pacific Railroad. This went to the Santa Fe, to the Southern Pacific. Iowa, the state just gave railroads almost everything, especially a railroad called the Rock Island Line back then. And massive government aid, huge. You are sitting on land that was given to the Northern Pacific Railroad in 1872. You're sitting on that land. The Northern Pacific Railroad went from Minneapolis, Milwaukee, to Seattle. The railroad went through Butte. Yet this land you're on, that's how big the land grants were. The idea was that the railroads could sell this land to settlers and build the railroad. But that land along the railroad is going to be the most valuable. And they can decide where the towns were, the terminals were. This is massive government aid. I should add that that means that the United States government is going to have to kick the people who live on this land off very brutally. There were people who lived on much of this land, or at least this was where their nomadic ranges were. So these are huge subsidies to business. Huge subsidies. And only certain companies got it. Only certain companies. That means the government is picking winners. And this goes beyond that, way beyond just this and this. If they're telling the United States government that the Union Pacific Railroad is going to be the railroad the government chooses to build the Transcontinental Railroad, and we're going to give them all this money, the United States is not going to allow that company to fail. And what that means is, if you're an investor and you want to buy stock in a company, a railroad corporation, are you going to invest in the company that the U.S. government has guaranteed their survival, or another company? Or if you're a bank, are you going to make a low interest loan to the railroad, the government that says, we're going to make sure they go? Or the other railroad? Do you see the big advantage that government aid gives? That is picking winners. It picks winners. And that's basically what happened in 2008 after the financial crash. The banks basically were in debt by about $35 trillion. And the US government just basically said, we're going to back you up. Don't worry about it. And what happened to those banks? That's like a massive subsidy. They're now bigger than ever. Because we've told those banks, we're not going to let you fail. So what do? Anything they want. That's what government aid does. It's more than the direct money. And so it wasn't, if you look at this map right here, you see all that land there, the land there? It's not every bit of that land. What they did is a checkerboard pattern. This is the legal term, checkerboard pattern. I'm not sure when I did that, but I've left it now. Every other section, every other 1 by 1 mile section went to the railroads. And so it wasn't every piece of land, it was government railroad, government railroad, government railroad, etc. It's still a massive amount of land, but it's not every square inch of that land. Huge government subsidies. Now, it doesn't, I'm not making a value judgment. They built the railroad. So it's not good or bad. That's something you have to decide. But certainly these railroads did not do it on their own. They did it with massive aid from taxpayers. Massive aid, which still goes on to this day. And so the first Transcontinental Railroad were 2 railroads actually. The Central Pacific going east from Sacramento. So Central Pacific going east. Union Pacific going west. Now, they're going to meet right here north of the Great Salt Lake. They did that for a couple different reasons. The first one is, if it's two railroads, the government wanted it done fast. And so they will race. Because every additional mile that that one railroad does, they get more money. And the other thing is, it looks like the Central Pacific has less, and it does. Less land. They're not quite, or a little bit over half the amount of miles. But these are massive mountains. Massive mountains. And so, Leland Stanford, you might have heard that name before. He was the head of the Central Pacific Railroad. And he knew every mile that goes through foothills and not plains are more money. Or if those foothills now become mountains, that's more money. So he found a very compliant geologist by the name of Josiah Whitney to say hundreds of miles of plains were foothills. Checked off on the box, essentially. And since this is California and Washington, D.C. is miles away, he got the money. And miles of foothills were mountains. This made Leland Stanford a shocking amount of money. And he would later, when he became governor of California, name the tallest peak in California and the entire continental United States after that geologist who gave him all the money. Mount Whitney in California is named after a financial scam. One of those little quirks of history. So, that gives you an idea just through Nebraska, the amount of land. I know it's every other section, but still, it's massive. And both railroads begin building this way. So you have surveyors, and then you have the grading crew to flatten the land. And then as fast as they could throw down the ties and the rails, they built the railroad. As fast as they could go, every mile is money. It's a race. They built it so shoddily that over the next 10 years, they had to replace every single tie and every single rail because it was so poorly made. They just, boom, went as fast as they can. Yeah. Omaha. The most cosmopolitan town in America. Omaha. Right? Everyone agree? Yeah, it's kind of the garden spot. The Central Pacific Railroad were desperate for laborers, and so they contracted with they were kind of like serfs in China, but Chinese immigrants, thousands, would be contracted, so basically paid for by their master, kind of like the landlord of the sharecroppers in the United States, to come over. About half would go back to China. Thousands died in the hell of the Sierra Nevada Railroad, or making the Sierra Nevadas. A lot of the miners or railroad workers who remained then would go to like Comstock, Denver, San Francisco, Helena, and yeah, but they were like serfs. A lot of their money went back home, but most would go back to China, or almost all would go back to China. The Union Pacific hired two groups of workers. One, and the slide disappeared, and I wonder if it's going to be like at the end, I accidentally moved it. But one were Paddies. Anyone know where Paddies are immigrants from? Ireland, yeah. Irish immigrants. And the other one, which I gotta find the slide. It wasn't in first period, and I'm sure I just must actually moved it. Were migrants. African Americans escaping with the poverty of the South after the Civil War. African Americans. A lot went west. The vast majority of people that today we call cowboys on the plains were African Americans. You wouldn't have known that from any Western movies you saw, or most of them, but yeah, they were African Americans. So, they would eventually meet in Promontory Point, Utah. And the amazing thing was, to make as much money as humanly possible, the grading crews and surveying crews actually passed each other and kept going for miles. And finally, the Grant administration had to step in and say, you're meeting here. And they just randomly picked a point. So they came up with the name Promontory Point. And it is one of the most desolate areas I've ever been. They got these kind of gumbo, clay, dry hills. It doesn't rain at all. The salt flats are just over the these little low hills from Promontory Point. I mean, it is one desolate place. Has anyone been there? If you drive down to Salt Lake City, drive down here, north of Ogden, north of Logan, it's to the west, and it has a bunch of acid side, Promontory Point. The National Park Service does it, and you go into this brown desert, and it's cool to go to, but boy is it desolate. They tried to make a town there, it didn't last. And when back in 15 years ago, so every state would make quarters. They had quarters where they would pick an emblem for their state. The first one was Delaware, the first state that ratified the Constitution. Montana was just before Utah, for example. Montana picked a version of a painting from Charles M. Russell for their quarter. Wyoming picked Wyoming. I can't remember what Wyoming picked, and I don't care. Utah picked the last spike, and the spike was famously made out of what? Gold. So the big ceremony, and they actually had silver spike, a gold spike. The thing about a gold spike, it's a little bit softer, so they actually had drilled the hole and just kind of tapped it in, and then immediately took it out. It's not there. An amalgamated gold and silver spike, and then a special spike that they said was tied to 2 telegraph lines. And so when the spike went in, it would connect the line to one constant noise all the way to Sacramento and San Francisco and to Washington, D.C. So they would tell those places the railroad is connected, or the railroad is complete, the United States is unified by rail. And here is the ceremony. And if you look closely at this, half of them are holding bottles. It was basically a 2-day drunk, and most of them are like, what are we doing here? Yes, holding a bottle right there. Later pictures of it, we changed it to like a trumpet and a laurel wreath. They didn't want to show everybody was drinking so much. And the last spike to connect that line would be by Leland Stanford, right here. And Mr. Zanto's kind of an expert on this.
This is too good not to be a picture. This is.
I've got some good ones in here.
Yeah.
I got them. Okay, send it. You put it in the newsletter? Okay.
Update.
And look at them, they were pretty good. Yeah, I got one, I'll send it to you. You guys are good. Genius. Do you want me to not send it?
Do it.
Do it. You didn't dress. All right. So back to this. So Stanford took the sledgehammer, and he had been drinking all day, and he could hardly put it up. And they had to kind of turn him to where the spike was, and he went and missed by about a yard, and then stumbled over it. But the whole thing was kind of a setup. It was actually a telegraph operator who just clicked it, and the buzz went. And so immediately there were massive celebrations in Washington, D.C. Sacramento had a huge party, and they unveiled a big banner that said, California annexes the United States. I thought that was kind of funny, but now the railroad is complete. And this, okay, obviously we'll come back to what the impact of the railroads were. But overnight now, that massive bison herd in the plains is now cut in two. And this will be the now very direct impact on the plains. Because once you have the railroads, this could bring in settlers, and the railroads can convince settlers to come there, telling them you'll get rich. And so, first off, we have to get to Leland Stanford. He would be the head of the Central Pacific Railroad. He would get shockingly rich. A lot of it by blatantly lying to the United States government about land and wealth. Well, and he took that money and paid himself a massive raise. And then the company paid it back. I will tell you how corporations work. And he would eventually become governor of California and would get very wealthy off of government subsidies. Very wealthy. And this would be a common practice. Many of the wealthiest Americans today are wealthy because of government subsidies, including a man who no one knows exactly how much he's worth. He's probably not the richest man in the world anymore, but Elon Musk. Government subsidies would have gone nowhere without that. But I do have to say,
and I always do say this, if you give me $20 billion, I could build an electric car that will be unreliable and not work very often too. I could do that. Heck, I could do that for 15 billion. That they don't have to recall them. They recalled 1.5 million last week. So, moving on. So, pretty soon you're going to have more transcontinental railroads. The Northern Pacific, the Santa Fe, the Southern Pacific, more and more government land would be given. Here is the Frisco, that was going to be a transcontinental railroad. They made it to Denver. We're done. And the Missouri Pacific, they made it to Denver. But this will give an example of one of the biggest scandals, but also show how corporations, the West, and government became more and more unified to get some people rich. Under the Grant administration was the Credit Mobilier scandal. The Credit Mobilier was a French bank from the Napoleonic era, so they took this name that people know. But the Credit Mobilier was actually a company. And the company shows how big companies can do all kinds of financial tricks to make a lot of money. The Credit Mobilier was actually created by stockholders of the Union Pacific. They created the Credit Mobilier to build the Union Pacific Railroad. So the Union Pacific Railroad, the owners of it, the stockholders, built another company to build the railroad. So the Union Pacific Railroad took the government money and other money they got and paid the Credit Mobilier to build the railroad. So to get the point here, they're paying themselves to build the railroad. Do you see a scam starting already? And this might shock you. The Credit Mobilier Company, which is owned by the very same people who own the Union Pacific, are going to tell the Union Pacific, this is so shocking. But the railroad actually cost 10 times more than what we thought. They blatantly overcharged the Union Pacific Railroad. Now I know what you're saying, wait a second, they're overcharging themselves. Not quite. Corporations don't work like companies owned by the individual. And so actually, the people who are the stockholders are cleaning up twice. And then they go to the US government, they went to Congress and said, oh, the railroad's costing too much. And so they asked the government for more money and they doubled the subsidy. This is a pretty good deal. Now, Congress, you got to imagine Congress is going to say, wait a second, we're not dumb. Well, maybe they are, but they are Congress. But the Credit Mobilier Company is owned by the Union Pacific Company. How can you charge yourself 10 times as much? And the Credit Mobilier Company went and back in private to members of Congress and explained to them, we're going to give you stock if you vote for it. Everybody wins. So they gave stock to cabinet members in the Grant administration and members of Congress. And guess what? Congress voted to double the subsidy. What do we call this? It's an element of that, but insider trading is an example of the broad legal term is fraud. This is fraud. Oh, and outright bribery. This is literally buying votes. When it became known, I should add, was Union Pacific Railroad punished for this? No, not at all. Because how do you punish a company? Okay, whose money? I will tell you, the great advantage of corporations down the road, it's really hard to punish a corporation. It's really hard. Well, this is going to taint all Congress. It tainted the whole Congress. It tainted the Grant administration. It tainted everybody. For years, politicians would have to run against the fact that they got Credit Mobilier stock. James Blaine looked like a shoo-in to be president in 1884. A shoo-in. But Uncle Grover Cleveland, was able to say, his campaign, that Blaine got Credit Mobilier stock. So, Uncle Grover won. So that is railroad expansion. And you can see 1860, a few tracks. The really big one, look from here, this is kind of shocking how much more the railroads cut, especially this area here. 1950, almost 400,000. This is actually 1990. Today it's about 100,000 miles of track. The United States is a lot less. This is actually a big problem because railroads are actually much cheaper and much more efficient. They pollute a lot less than everything but boats. But we don't have a lot of railroads anymore. But we used to have a massive expansion. And the first anti-immigrant law will be in the West because of railroads. 1884, I forgot to say it, so 1884, the Chinese Exclusion Act. And yes, it was clearly done by color of skin. The Chinese Exclusion Act, the first anti-immigration law in the United States. And it basically kept Chinese immigrants out, and this horrifically racist immigrant, here's Uncle Sam, and this is one showing the double bit of nativism and anti-immigrant feeling. Here's Uncle Sam being swallowed up by Irish and Chinese until eventually only there, and the word they started using by the turn of the century, some of you might have heard this today, replaced by nativists. And then eventually the Chinese immigrants would eat the Irish immigrants. And they'd be taken over by Chinese, and that really showed this racist fear of that. It's kind of amazing how quickly that happened. And so that's Montana. Montana's Transcontinental Railroad would be the Northern Pacific, funded by the United States government. And their last spike, if you drive to Missoula, near Gold, and look to the left, they have a marker on the railroad where that last spike was on the track. It's still marked on the railroad today. And one thing I should add, a railroad, and they basically just gave themselves big raises and went bankrupt 4 different times. They just took the government money and just stole it. It's actually shocking what the Northern Pacific Railroad did. Another railroad that didn't take the subsidies directly was the Great Northern. And not only did the Great Northern prosper, they bought the Northern Pacific. And then they bought the Burlington route, which was a big plains railroad, became the Burlington Northern. And then they bought the massive Santa Fe Railroad. That one railroad eventually would become the Burlington Northern Santa Fe. And now that's the biggest railroad monopoly in the United States. So that's railroads. And so look at all the railroad by 1790 across the West. And that would directly trigger the final last stand of American railroads. The last stand. And this is this is a little bit dramatized of the first transcontinental trains going through and splitting the herd. But the railroads totally split the herds and disrupted the bison. That bison number started dropping even before the massive waves of buffalo hunters came, because it just totally destroyed their migration habits and therefore their breeding habits. But yeah, people did ride on the trains and take pot shots at any animal they could along the plains. They're alive, they must die kind of attitude. Yeah, they did shoot bison along the way. And so this will be the Plains Indian Wars, 1860 to 1890. The last stand. But I have to be clear, after the Battle of Fallen Timbers and Tippecanoe in Ohio and Indiana, there's no chance the American Indians are going to stop the United States. It's only a matter of how long and how brutal the defeat's going to be. It's going to be. And so, the U.S. tactics, the one that goes back to every colonial power, everybody who wants to colonize and kick out the original settlers, as far as there's time, divide and conquer. And so, they would play tribal rivalries against each other, ally with one tribe, go against another one. I mean, if you know anything what's happening in Israel, that's what Israel does. And right now, and I should add, between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, that's another story. But in Montana, the Crow, which lived right here, hated the Lakota. So the United States, and they hated the Lakota and the Sioux. So the U.S. played on that, used the Crow to help defeat the Lakota and the Sioux, and then turned around and forced the Crow to completely swing it. Ironically,
the Crow Reservation and part of the Cheyenne Reservation, called the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, are right next to each other. And they despise each other with a hatred that's hard to put into terms. And it's so ironic they're next to each other. A good friend of mine in high school was, he and his sister were really good friends of mine, and they were Cheyenne. And somebody said something about going to Hardin, which was on the Crow Reservation. And they said, never call us Crow. They got so mad. And I thought, it was real mad. It was real angry. So finish this last little bit tomorrow right after the quiz. Sound good? Tomorrow is another day. It's just another day.